When I was 14, my family and I took a camping trip to a state park. My friend and I were thrilled about spending the days exploring the woods and the nights swapping scary stories around the fire. We had no idea that what started as an innocent adventure would turn into something far more sinister. As we set up camp, my friend and I decided to do what we called the walk, a little ritual of ours, where we'd venture into the forest with nothing but our flashlights and our sense of curiosity. But that night, for some reason, we pushed farther than ever before. The deeper we went, the taller the trees seemed to grow, their twisting branches blotting out the moonlight. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made us glance over our shoulders, but we assured ourselves it was just the wind or some harmless animal. Then we heard it, the whispering. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it surrounded us, threading through the trees like an invisible presence. We spun around, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. Brushing it off, we kept walking, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until we couldn't ignore them anymore. And then we saw her. She was crawling, her body low to the ground, her dark clothes blending into the shadows. Her lips moved, murmuring something unintelligible, her voice barely above a breath. We froze, beams of light locked onto her. Slowly, she lifted her head, her hollow eyes meeting ours before she stumbled upright. "I'm looking for my campsite," she slurred, her words thick and uneven. My friend and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we couldn't just leave her there. So we helped her back, guiding her as she staggered, muttering nonsense under her breath. When we finally reached her site, it was empty, her friends had left, unaware that she was missing. We helped her into her tent and hurried back to our own, but something about the encounter gnawed at us. Something wasn't right. The next day, we spotted her again, sitting by the campfire, staring blankly into the distance. Her skin was ashen, her eyes sunken, her presence deeply unsettling. We tried to keep our distance, but no matter where we went, she always seemed to be nearby, hovering just at the edge of our vision. That night, desperate to shake the unease, we set out for the walk again. Maybe if we faced the woods, the whispers, the creeping sense of dread, we could put it all behind us. But the moment we stepped beyond the trees, the whispering returned, louder this time, more urgent. We turned, flashlights sweeping in frantic circles. No one. And then she was there. She stood before us, her face pallid, her eyes void-like and black as coal. Her lips moved rapidly, the whispers turning into a feverish chant. We tried to run, but our legs wouldn't obey. It felt as if the ground itself was holding us in place. She took a step forward, then another, the sound of her whispering growing unbearable. Everything went black. When I came to, I was back at our campsite. My friend was shaking me, his face pale with worry. "You just collapsed," he said, his voice tight with fear. I sat up, my entire body trembling. "We need to leave. Now." We tore down our tents, stuffed everything into our bags, and left before the sun had even risen. We didn't look back. We never talked about it. But even now, the memory lingers, creeping into my dreams like a shadow in the trees. I still hear the whispering. And I still wonder, what really happened that night in the woods? Next story. When I first met Daniel, he seemed like any other guy. We were both looking for a roommate to help with rent, and he was polite, tidy, and easy to get along with. We found a small apartment and moved in together, and for a while, everything was normal. Living with Daniel was actually enjoyable. He would cook meals from time to time, and we'd split the chores without any complaints. We'd spend evenings watching movies or just talking about life. He worked at a small bookstore downtown, while I had a job at a coffee shop nearby. Our routine was simple, peaceful. Then things started to shift. Daniel became distant, secretive. He started staying out late, coming home with a strange look in his eyes. When I asked where he'd been, he'd just shrug and say he was out with friends. But something didn't feel right. At night, I'd hear him talking on the phone in a low, steady voice, saying things that didn't make sense. Once, I heard him whisper, "They can't find out. It's too risky." One evening, I got home late from work. The apartment was nearly pitch dark, except for a faint glow coming from under Daniel's door. As I passed by, I heard something, soft, broken sobs. I knocked. No answer. Then the crying stopped. A chill crawled down my spine. "Daniel, are you okay?" I called out. A long silence. Then his voice, quiet and flat, "Yeah, just tired. Going to bed." The next morning, he was back to normal, acting as if nothing had happened. But the unease never left me. After that, I started noticing other things. Small stains on his clothes that he'd quickly try to hide. A knife in the bathroom cabinet with dried blood on the blade. When I confronted him about it, he laughed it off, claiming he'd cut himself while cooking. Weeks passed, but the sense of dread only deepened. I started spending more time at work or out with friends, avoiding the apartment as much as possible. Even then, I couldn't shake the fear that wrapped itself around me whenever I was home. One evening, when Daniel went out, I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I searched his room. I felt guilty invading his space, but I needed answers. Pushing aside some clothes in his closet, I found a box tucked away in the corner. My hands trembled as I pulled it out and lifted the lid. Inside were newspaper clippings, articles about unsolved murders in our city, each one marked with notes in Daniel's handwriting. Photos of the victims. Details about the crime scenes. Small, personal objects that clearly hadn't belonged to him. A cold, sick feeling settled in my stomach. I shoved everything back into the box, slammed the closet door shut, and stumbled out of his room, my mind racing. I had to leave. Now. Grabbing my phone, I left the apartment and walked aimlessly until I found myself at a park. I sat on a bench, trying to steady my breathing before dialing the police. When they arrived, I told them everything. I led them to the apartment and showed them the box. They didn't dismiss me. They asked questions, about Daniel, his behavior, his routine. They assured me they'd investigate. The next few days blurred together. I stayed with a friend, too terrified to return home. The police kept me updated. They were watching Daniel, waiting for enough evidence to make an arrest. Then, one night, my phone rang. They had caught him. Daniel had been arrested while trying to dispose of another victim's belongings. The evidence they found in our apartment linked him to several murders. Relief. Horror. Disbelief. It all crashed over me at once. The person I had lived with, trusted, laughed with, had been a murderer all along. I went back to the apartment to pack my things. The space felt different now. Darker. Like every shadow was hiding a secret I had been too blind to see. While gathering my belongings, I found something on my nightstand. A note. "I'm sorry you found out this way. I never wanted to hurt you. You were the only real friend I had. Goodbye." I left that night and never went back. I moved to a new city, trying to start fresh. But the memories followed me. The paranoia. The fear. The endless questions that had no answers. How had I not seen the signs sooner? How many lives could have been saved if I had? Living with Daniel changed me. I became guarded, cautious. I never let anyone get too close. Because once you've lived with a killer, you never forget. Next story. I was driving down a deserted highway late at night, the road stretching endlessly ahead like a black ribbon unraveling into the dark. The only light came from my headlights and the faint glow of the moon hanging low in the sky. Fatigue weighed heavy on me, and the quiet hum of the engine was the only sound keeping me company. The radio had lost its signal miles ago, leaving nothing but silence and my own wandering thoughts. That's when I noticed the gas gauge, dangerously low. I should have stopped at the last town to fill up, but I had convinced myself I could make it to the next one. Now, I wasn't so sure. The needle hovered just above empty, and there wasn't a gas station in sight. Then, the car sputtered. I pressed the gas pedal, but it did nothing. The engine choked, gave a final, wheezing cough, and died. The car rolled to a slow stop at the side of the road, my stomach twisting with frustration. No, 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 I muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine cranked but wouldn't turn over. I tried again. Nothing. I was completely out of gas, stranded in the middle of nowhere. I pulled out my phone, hoping to call for help, but my heart sank when I saw no signal glaring back at me. I was completely cut off. No cars. No houses. Just endless trees and darkness pressing in from all sides. With no other option, I locked the doors and stayed inside. Maybe a car would pass by, or maybe my phone would pick up a signal if I waited long enough. Wandering around in the dark didn't seem like a smart idea. The car, locked and sealed, felt safer. Minutes turned into hours. I kept checking my phone, but the signal never returned. The night was eerily silent, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. My nerves started to fray, every creak and rustle outside making me flinch. Then, movement. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something shift just beyond the tree line. I turned my head. A figure stepped out from the woods. My pulse hammered against my ribs as the figure drew closer. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his hair unkempt and his beard scruffy. His clothes were filthy, and he moved with an unsettling slowness. He walked right up to my window and peered inside, his eyes wide, almost too wide. Then, he knocked. Once. Twice. A slow, deliberate rhythm against the glass. "Hey," he said, his voice muffled through the window. "Let me in. I need help." I gripped the steering wheel, my body locked in place. Everything in me screamed, "Do not open the door." He knocked again, harder this time. "Please," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "Let me in." I shook my head, barely breathing. A long silence stretched between us. Then, just as my fear started to spiral, I saw it, headlights approaching from behind. Relief surged through me. I honked the horn, desperate to get the driver's attention. The vehicle slowed and pulled up behind me. The glow of red and blue lights filled my rearview mirror. A police car. 2 officers stepped out, flashlights cutting through the dark. The man at my window stiffened. "Is everything all right here?" one of the officers asked, his light shining into my car. I fumbled with the lock and pushed the door open. "My car ran out of gas," I said, my voice unsteady. This man came out of the woods and started knocking on my window. "I don't know what he wants." The officers turned their flashlights on the man. He took a step back, eyes darting between them. "Sir," one of the officers said, stepping forward, "what are you doing out here?" The man didn't answer. He just turned and started walking back into the trees. The officers watched him disappear into the darkness, their hands resting on their holsters. Then, one of them turned back to me. "You're lucky we came by," he said. "It's not safe to be out here alone at night. We'll call a tow truck and give you a ride to town." I nodded, still shaken, as I slid into the back of the police car. As we pulled away, I looked back at the woods. The man was gone, swallowed by the shadows. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just escaped something terrible. That night on the highway stuck with me, a cold reminder of how fast things can go wrong, how quickly a routine drive can turn into something else entirely. And I still wonder, even now, what might have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. Next story. I had just turned 30 when I decided to rent a room in a 3-bedroom house. The landlord, Mr. Thompson, seemed eager to lease the space, skipping any background checks. That struck me as odd, but I needed a place fast, and the rent was cheap. I didn't ask too many questions. The house was old but cozy, with 3 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a modest living room, and a shared bathroom. My only roommate, Elizabeth, worked nights and kept to herself. Though I had lived there for over a month, I had never actually seen her. Our schedules never overlapped, and she seemed intensely private. Then, strange things started happening. My belongings would move. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter, only to find them on the dining table. My toothbrush would be wet when I hadn't touched it. At first, I blamed my own forgetfulness, but the unease grew. One evening, I came home to find the front door slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it before leaving. Cautiously, I stepped inside. "Hello? Anyone here?" Silence. Everything appeared normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. That night, I double-checked every window and door, ensuring they were locked. Then came the noises. Late at night, footsteps echoed above me, despite Elizabeth being at work. Sometimes, I heard a soft humming, like someone singing a lullaby just under their breath. It sent shivers down my spine. I tried convincing myself it was just the house settling, just my imagination. Then came Friday night. I was lounging on the couch, watching TV, trying to shake off the creeping paranoia. But suddenly, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned my head. Nothing. I exhaled and tried to refocus on the screen. Then, the light went out. The TV still glowed, casting eerie flickers across the room. I sat frozen. In the dim glow, I saw movement in the hallway. A shadow. Elizabeth. She stood still, watching me. "Elizabeth?" My voice came out unsteady. She didn't answer. She simply turned and disappeared into the darkness. I leapt from the couch, flipped the light switch back on, and bolted to my room, locking the door behind me. Sleep never came that night. I lay awake, heart racing, thinking about her, standing there, silent in the dark. By morning, I had made up my mind. I threw some clothes into a bag and checked into a motel. I needed space, time to clear my head. From there, I called Mr. Thompson and told him everything. He seemed troubled but didn't offer much insight. The motel felt safer, and for the first time in weeks, I got some sleep. The next afternoon, I returned to gather the rest of my things. The house felt off. Unnaturally quiet. I rushed to my room and started packing. As I left, I passed Elizabeth's door. It was slightly ajar. I hesitated. Then, unable to resist, I nudged it open. The air inside was heavy, stale. The room was sparse, just a small bed, a dresser, and old photographs on the wall. It looked untouched, abandoned for years. Confused, I stepped inside. The pictures drew me in. They were all of a young woman, one who looked exactly like Elizabeth. One photo stood out. It was of Mr. Thompson, much younger, standing beside her. I turned it over. The date, 20 years ago. Ice crawled through my veins. That didn't make sense. Elizabeth hadn't aged a day. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around. Nothing. I grabbed the photograph and ran. Straight to Mr. Thompson. When I showed him the picture, his face went pale. His hands trembled as he sank into a chair. Finally, in a hushed voice, he admitted the truth. Elizabeth was his sister. She had vanished 20 years ago under mysterious circumstances. He had kept her room the same, hoping, praying, she would return one day. But I had seen her. I had lived with her. Or had I? I moved out that day, refusing to spend another night in that house. I never looked back. Even now, late at night, I think about Elizabeth. About what she was. Or what she had become. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Next story. My girlfriend and I had planned a camping trip for our anniversary, 5 hours away from home, deep in the wilderness. We made the drive the day after a heavy storm had passed through, leaving the road slick and the air thick with the scent of wet earth. We arrived at the campground early in the afternoon, and the guy at the entrance casually mentioned that we were the only ones staying there that weekend. That should have been unsettling, but instead, we looked at each other and thought, nice, we've got the whole place to ourselves. The drive to our designated site took us down long, winding paths that narrowed the deeper we went. By the time we reached our spot, I realized there was only one way in, and one way out. If we needed to leave, we'd have to reverse all the way back. We set up the tent, unloaded the car, and decided to explore the woods while we still had daylight. It was dead silent. No birds. No wind. Just the crunch of our boots on damp leaves. We walked a few miles until we stumbled upon something strange, rows of identical, white cabins, neatly lined up in the middle of nowhere. They were uniform, eerily clean, and completely lifeless. They felt wrong. There was no sign of recent use, no people, no movement, just stillness. Something about them made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My girlfriend must have felt the same way because she grabbed my arm and whispered, "Let's go back." We didn't run, but we didn't take our time either. Back at camp, we tried to start a fire. Neither of us had ever been camping before, so it took a frustratingly long time to get it going. Everything around us was still drenched from the storm. We used self-lighting logs and lighter fluid, struggling to find any dry kindling. Eventually, we got a small fire burning, cooked some hot dogs, roasted marshmallows, and watched the stars. Then we realized just how dark it was. With no nearby campers, no artificial light, and the thick forest surrounding us, it felt like the world ended just outside the glow of our fire. My girlfriend, who had a habit of spooking easily, whispered, "Can we go in the tent now?" I put out the fire, and we crawled into the tent, settling in for the night. We were talking quietly when she suddenly pressed her hand over my mouth. "Shoo! Do you hear that?" I listened. Footsteps. Heavy ones. Not one set. Multiple. I whispered, "It's probably just animals." Then we heard it. Mumbling. Low. Indistinct. Human. We sat frozen, staring at each other in the darkness. The mumbling grew louder. So did the footsteps. They circled our tent. My girlfriend clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. I could hear her breathing, shallow and ragged. And then, silence. We waited. And waited. And waited. I don't know how long we sat there, trapped in the suffocating stillness, too afraid to move. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "We have to get to the car." Adrenaline kicked in. I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. Blackness. Nothing. I turned back. "Stay behind me." We bolted. I fumbled with the car door, got in, locked it, and scanned the tree line. There was no one. Nothing. "I'm grabbing our stuff," I said. "Stay in the car." We had only brought a tent and an ice chest. I sprinted to the cooler, grabbed it, and tossed it into the back seat. Then I heard them again. The footsteps. Getting closer. I yanked the tent from the ground, bundled it into my arms, and practically threw it into the trunk. I climbed into the car, gripping the wheel. "Do we have everything?" "Yes." I floored it in reverse, barely avoiding trees as I sped away from our campsite. Then we hit a problem. The path split in 6 different directions. My girlfriend and I stared at each other. Which way did we come from? I don't know. I picked one at random and ended up in another empty campsite. Cursing, I reversed again. Then, from this new angle, I saw it, a small, barely visible sign behind an overgrown bush, pointing the way back to the main road. As I turned onto the correct path, I glanced one last time toward our campsite. That's when I saw it. A single, small green light. Deep in the woods. Exactly where we had been. We didn't stop driving until we were back in town, pulling into my girlfriend's parents' driveway at 4 a.m. We collapsed on their couch and slept without a word. We never talked about it. Never tried to make sense of what happened. And I haven't been camping since. Next story. I grew up in a small town in South Texas, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing ever really happens. When I was 19, my boyfriend Jack, our friends Amy and Mike, and I decided to go for a late-night drive. We were bored, looking for something, anything, to break up the monotony of another summer night. We cruised around for a while, aimlessly talking and laughing, until Jack suggested something different. "Let's go to the old cemetery," he said. It was a burial ground from the 1800s, long abandoned and infamous for its eerie atmosphere. People whispered about strange occurrences there, but we had never actually gone to see for ourselves. At the time, it seemed like a great idea. We had no clue what we were walking into. Jack drove us down an old back road, barely wide enough for his car. The trees on either side grew thick and close, swallowing what little moonlight filtered through. The further we went, the quieter it got. No more crickets. No more rustling leaves. Just the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. By the time we reached the cemetery, it was 3 a.m. A thick fog had begun to creep across the ground, making the rusted iron gate ahead of us look even more ominous. It barely hung onto its hinges, swaying slightly in the breeze. Jack killed the engine, and we climbed out. The night air felt different, colder than it should have been. We stepped inside, our footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The headstones were worn and weathered, some barely legible. Shadows stretched across the uneven ground, making it hard to tell what was real and what was just a trick of the light. Then Amy whispered, "What's that?" She pointed toward the far end of the cemetery. We all turned, squinting through the fog. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Then I saw them. 4 figures. Dressed in white hoods. They moved in a slow, deliberate circle around a grave, their motions precise and rhythmic, like they were performing some kind of ritual. A heavy silence fell over us. My stomach twisted into knots. "We should go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But none of us moved. Jack, always the one to act fearless, stood just as still as the rest of us, his hands clenched at his sides. Then, as if snapping out of a trance, he muttered, "Yeah, let's get out of here." We turned back toward the car, moving fast but trying not to make a sound. Jack fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he jammed them into the ignition. The car roared to life, and he floored it, speeding away from the cemetery as fast as he could. None of us spoke on the drive back. No laughter. No joking around. Just the sound of the tires on the road and the occasional glance in the rearview mirror. When we finally made it back to town, Jack parked outside Amy's house. We all just sat there in silence, trying to process what we had seen. "What do you think they were doing?" Amy finally asked. Mike shook his head. "I don't know, and I don't want to know." None of us argued. We all agreed, whatever it wasn't something we wanted to stick around and find out. We promised never to go back to that cemetery. Never to talk about it again. But I never forgot. Even now, whenever I drive past that old back road, I get a chill. And I still wonder. Who were they? And what were they doing out there at 3 a.m.? Next story. I never imagined I'd end up with such an unsettling roommate. It all started innocently enough when I moved into a small apartment in the heart of the city. The rent was cheap, the location was perfect, and I wasn't too picky about who I lived with. That was before I met Alex. Tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed fixed on something beyond reality, he carried an air of quiet unease. At first, I chalked up his odd behavior to mere eccentricity. He kept to himself, rarely spoke, and spent most of his time locked away in his room. But soon, I started noticing things. It began with the whispers. Late at night, when the world outside was still, I'd hear him murmuring behind his door. At first, I assumed he was on the phone or watching something strange. But the whispers grew louder. More urgent. The tones of his voice shifted, like he was having a feverish conversation with someone, or something, unseen. Then came the smell. A foul, putrid stench seeped from his room, growing stronger by the day. It clung to the air like decay, thick and suffocating. I told myself it was just the old pipes, the age of the building. But deep down, I knew better. I confronted him once. Asked him about the odor. He only laughed, a dry, humorless sound, and muttered something about a spilled drink he hadn't cleaned up yet. But the smell didn't go away. Neither did the whispers. Or the way he moved, gliding through the apartment like a shadow, silent and watchful. I started waking up in the middle of the night, sensing eyes on me. I'd turn toward my door, half expecting to see Alex standing there, but the hallway would be empty. Or so I thought. One night, sleep eluded me entirely, and curiosity won over fear. I crept toward his room, my pulse pounding in my ears. The door was ajar, just slightly, and a thin strip of flickering light stretched into the hallway. I hesitated, my breath shallow. Then, I pushed it open. The air inside was thick with the stench of burnt wax and something rotting. Alex stood in the center, surrounded by candles casting erratic shadows across the walls. An old, crumbling book was clutched in his hands, its pages yellowed with time. And he was chanting. A guttural, unnatural language spilled from his lips, vibrating in the air like a presence of its own. Then I saw it. A thing hunched in the far corner. Twisted. Wrong. Its eyes, two gleaming orbs of pure malice, locked onto mine. The air grew thick and suffocating. My body screamed at me to move, to run, but I was frozen, pinned beneath an unseen weight. Alex's chanting grew louder. And the figure moved. That was enough to break whatever hold had rooted me in place. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I turned and bolted for my room. I slammed the door shut and locked it, heart hammering against my ribs as I pressed my back against the wall. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Morning came, but the fear remained. And Alex? He acted like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't just walked in on something I was never supposed to see. Then, one night, he was gone. I searched the apartment, every room, every corner. But it was as if he had never existed. His door, usually locked tight, hung open, revealing an empty space. No candles. No book. No thing lurking in the shadows. But the feeling lingered. That creeping, gnawing sensation that I wasn't alone. The first time I heard the scratching, I told myself it was just rats in the walls. Until the scratches turned into knocking. Until they turned into whispers. And then, one by one, they appeared. Crawling out of the darkness. Their limbs unnatural. Their eyes hollow. They surrounded me, their movements jerky, unnatural. And in the doorway, standing perfectly still, was Alex. "You can't leave," he whispered. His voice was wrong, layered, like more than one person was speaking at once. "You belong to us now." That was all I needed to hear. I ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't take anything with me. I don't know how I made it out, only that I never returned. I moved to another city, started fresh, tried to forget. But some nights, when everything is still and silent, I hear it again. The scratching. The whispers. And I know, deep in my bones, that Alex, whatever he truly was, never really left. And he's still waiting. Next story. It was late, and the darkness deepened with every passing mile. I was driving home, my 2 young children fussing in the back seat. Their constant bickering had frayed my patience to its last thread. Finally, I pulled over to the side of the road, flipping on the hazard lights. I stepped out, opening the back door. "Listen, you two," I said, keeping my voice firm. "You need to stop fighting. It's late, and we need to get home safely." As I spoke, I noticed a car pulling up alongside us. The window rolled down, revealing a middle-aged couple. The man leaned out, offering a warm smile. "Hey there, are you okay?" he asked. "Yeah, we're fine," I replied. "Just had to calm the kids down." The woman in the passenger seat nodded. "We wanted to let you know, there's been a wreck just over the next hill. Traffic is backed up. It'd be best if you took the side road a little ways back," the man added. "It'll detour you around the wreck and get you home faster." I thanked them for the tip, and they waved as they drove off. I got back into the car, fastening my seatbelt, but something about their advice nagged at me. I wasn't familiar with this stretch of road, and taking an unfamiliar detour in the dark didn't sit right with me. I decided to stick to the main road, even if it meant dealing with traffic. A few minutes later, I passed the turn they had suggested. Curious, I glanced down the road. And my stomach dropped. There, parked just off the detour road, was the couple's car. And they were standing outside of it. Not moving. Just staring into the woods. A thick wall of trees loomed around them, swallowing the road in darkness. A chill crept up my spine. Why had they stopped there? Had their car broken down? Had they changed their minds about their own advice? I shook off the unease and kept driving, reassuring myself it was just a coincidence. Then, as I crested the hill, I braced for the sight of wreckage or flashing lights. But there was nothing. No traffic jam. No accident. Just an empty road stretching ahead of me. I exhaled, feeling an odd mixture of relief and dread. The rest of the drive was quiet, my children had finally drifted off to sleep, but my thoughts raced. I couldn't shake the image of that couple. Something about the whole encounter felt wrong. The next morning, I had errands to run and found myself on the same road again. As I approached the turn they had suggested, my pulse quickened. Slowing the car, I peered down the road. And then I saw it. A large, weathered sign stood just past where they had parked. Dead end. A cold weight settled in my chest. Why would they try to send me down a road that led nowhere? What were they doing there in the dead of night, staring into the woods? And why had they vanished so quickly after speaking to me? Years have passed, but I still think about that night. Every time I drive past that road, I feel the same unease coil in my gut. Sometimes, on those long, lonely drives, I swear I catch a glimpse of their car in the distance. Always in the same spot. Just before the hill. Right before the dead-end sign. But when I turn my head to look, there's nothing there. It's as if they're still waiting for someone to take their detour. I don't know who they were. I don't know what would have happened if I had followed their advice. But I do know one thing. That night, my instincts saved me. And now, I trust them more than ever. So if you're ever out on a lonely road, and a friendly stranger suggests a shortcut, think twice. Because sometimes, the long way home is the only way to make it back at all. Next story. It was late on a Friday night when I finally left the office. The clock on my dashboard read just shy of midnight, and exhaustion weighed heavy on me. After a long week of working late, all I wanted was to get home and collapse into bed. The usual route through the city was always packed, even at this hour, and I wasn't in the mood to sit through endless stoplights. So I took a rural detour, longer, but quieter. A peaceful drive, I thought. Something to help me unwind. The road stretched out before me, empty and endless. The moon was full, casting a silver glow over the landscape, and the only sounds were the steady hum of my engine and the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. For a while, I enjoyed the solitude. But as I drove deeper into the countryside, something shifted. The darkness felt heavier. The air, colder. Then, in the distance, I saw the bridge. It was old, wood and iron, worn down by time. I had driven over it before, but only during the day. Now, under the pale moonlight, it looked different. More ominous. The wooden planks creaked beneath my tires as I approached. And then, the fog appeared. Thick. Unnatural. It rolled in from nowhere, glowing faintly red, swallowing the bridge ahead. I slowed the car. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself it was just a trick of the night. Just exhaustion playing with my senses. I drove forward. The moment my tires hit the bridge, the air around me grew heavy. Pressing. Like something unseen was closing in. The fog thickened, swirling against my windshield. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel, forcing myself to focus. Almost there. Just a little further. Then I made the mistake of looking in the rearview mirror. And my heart nearly stopped. A figure stood in the middle of the bridge. A woman. Dressed in white. Her long, dark hair hung over her face, unmoving in the breeze. She was staring at my car. Not moving. Just watching. I blinked, hoping it was a trick of the light. She was still there. My breath hitched. My pulse pounded in my ears. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just kept driving, my gaze flicking between the road and the mirror. She never moved. Never followed. Just stood there. Shrouded in red fog. By the time I reached home, I locked the doors and windows, my heart still hammering. I kept telling myself it was just a shadow, a strange illusion in the mist. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image of that figure on the bridge. Over breakfast, I hesitated before mentioning it to my parents. They exchanged a glance. And my father's face darkened. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked. A chill crept down my spine. "Who?" "The girl on the bridge," he said grimly. An old legend. A tragedy that had happened years ago. A young woman named Emily had once stood on that bridge, waiting for someone who never came. Some say it was a lover who abandoned her. Others say she was running from something far worse. But everyone agreed on one thing. She never left the bridge. For weeks, I avoided that road. But the memory of that night clung to me. The red fog. The silent figure. The way she had just stood there. Watching. I dreamed of her. Again and again. Waking in a cold sweat, her face hidden behind the curtain of her hair. Then, one evening, curiosity won over fear. I searched for her story. Newspaper clippings. Town records. Her name was Emily. She had hung herself from the iron railings of that bridge decades ago. And ever since, travelers had reported the same thing. A red fog. A figure in white. Standing in the center of the bridge. Waiting. Some believed she was searching for her lost love. Others thought she was warning people. Or maybe she was looking for someone to take her place. A month later, I found myself on that road again. The bridge loomed ahead. The fog was there. Thick. Glowing. And so was she. Standing in the exact same spot. This time, I did something different. I stopped the car. Rolled down the window. And whispered, "I'm sorry." For a moment, she didn't move. Then she started to fade. The red fog lifted, dissolving into the night. And she was gone. I never saw her again. But I never forgot. Even now, when I drive past that bridge, I slow down. And I wonder. Did I really help her find peace? Or is she still there? Still waiting?